Why does God say wait, not no? Because those are two completely different answers, and treating them as the same one is what makes people give up on something that was never actually taken away from them. Most people never hear a clear no from God. What they hear is silence, an unanswered prayer, a door that hasn't opened yet, a person who hasn't arrived, a breakthrough that hasn't come. And in that silence, it's easy to fill in the blank yourself. You assume the silence means rejection, because rejection at least gives you an answer, even a painful one. Waiting without an answer feels worse than a no, so the mind reaches for the no just to make the uncertainty stop. But Habakkuk 2:3 describes exactly this kind of season. The revelation awaits an appointed time. Though it linger, wait for it, because it will certainly come and will not delay. Read that carefully. It doesn't say the promise might come, it says it will certainly come. The lingering isn't evidence against the promise, it's described as part of the promise's own timeline, an appointed time that hasn't arrived yet, not a promise that was cancelled. Here's what's actually at stake if you keep confusing wait with no. You start making permanent decisions based on a temporary season. You close doors that were never meant to be closed. You talk yourself out of hope that was never actually false, just early. And once you've convinced yourself the answer was no, it becomes very hard to stay open to the appointed time Habakkuk describes, because you've already grieved something that hadn't actually ended. Think about Sarah, waiting for the child she'd been promised. Genesis 18:14 records God's response to her doubt directly. "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time, and Sarah will have a son." Notice that phrase again, appointed time. It appears in both of these passages for a reason. It's not vague, hopeful language. It's a specific claim that delay has a structure to it, a moment already set, even when the person waiting can't see that structure from where they're standing. Sarah's waiting wasn't a short season. It stretched across years, well past the point where it made biological sense, well past the point where most people would have called it over. And for a long stretch of that waiting, she did what most people do. She assumed the promise had quietly become a no, and she tried to manufacture the outcome herself instead. That attempt didn't speed anything up. It just added complication to a story that eventually unfolded exactly the way it was originally promised, on a timeline that had never actually changed, no matter how long the silence stretched. This is where it helps to separate two very different things, a closed door and a door that simply hasn't opened yet. A closed door has a clear, specific no attached to it, a rejection, an ending, a circumstance that makes the outcome genuinely impossible. A door that hasn't opened yet has no such no attached. It's simply not time. The problem is that from the outside, in the middle of the waiting, these two things can feel identical. Both involve a door that isn't open right now. The difference isn't visible in the present moment, it's only visible in hindsight, once the appointed time actually arrives. Think about Joseph for a moment. A different waiting story than Sarah's, but built on the same pattern. Sold by his own brothers, forgotten in a prison for years after doing the right thing, watching other people's dreams get fulfilled, while his own promise, the one he'd been shown as a young man, seemed to go nowhere. If you had asked Joseph, sitting in that prison cell for what stretched into years, whether the door on his promise was closed or simply not yet open, there would have been no way for him to know from where he stood. Every visible sign pointed to closed. The only thing that eventually proved otherwise was time itself, arriving at an appointed moment he couldn't have predicted or manufactured on his own. What's worth noticing in Joseph's story is what he did during the parts that looked like a closed door. He didn't stop showing up fully to wherever he was, not in the pit, not in Potiphar's house, not in the prison. Each of those seasons, on their own, looked like proof the promise had failed. None of them turned out to be the ending. They turned out to be the specific, unglamorous path the appointed time took to arrive. That's easy to say looking backward at a finished story. It would have been almost impossible to trust while still inside it. which is exactly the position most people waiting on something right now are actually in. So how do you tell the difference while you're still in it, without the benefit of hindsight? You mostly can't, not with certainty, and that's exactly why Scripture doesn't tell you to figure out which one you're in. It tells you to wait regardless. Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." It's repeated twice in the same verse, which is unusual, and that repetition isn't an accident. It's emphasis on something the writer knew people would need to hear more than once, because waiting without knowing the outcome is one of the hardest postures a person can hold. Notice also what that verse pairs with the waiting. Be strong and take heart. Waiting, in this instruction, isn't passive collapse. It's not sitting in a room doing nothing, hoping something eventually changes on its own. It's active, it requires strength, and it requires courage, because waiting without proof of an outcome is genuinely difficult to sustain. The verse doesn't promise the waiting will be easy. It tells you what waiting well actually requires, the same strength and courage you'd need for anything hard, applied to something that doesn't look hard from the outside, because nothing visible is happening. Here's something worth sitting with. The length of the wait is not a reliable measure of whether the promise is real. Some promises take weeks, some take years, some take longer than a person's patience feels capable of sustaining. 2 Peter 3:8-9 addresses this directly. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness, but is patient. That verse was written specifically because people were losing faith based on time passing, assuming that because something hadn't happened yet, it wasn't going to happen at all. The response isn't that time doesn't matter. It's that your measurement of time and the actual timeline of the promise are not operating on the same scale, and mistaking one for the other is where despair usually starts. This matters practically, not just theologically. If you've been waiting for something, a relationship, a breakthrough, a door to open, a wrong situation to finally end, and it's taken longer than you expected, that length of time by itself tells you nothing about whether the promise is still standing. It only tells you that you're inside a season you don't yet have the full view of. People who gave up right before their answer arrived didn't fail because they lacked faith completely. They failed to distinguish a long wait from a cancelled promise, and the two are not the same thing, no matter how similar they feel after enough time has passed. It might help to name a few practical signs that you're likely still inside a wait rather than a closed door, not as guarantees, but as honest questions worth sitting with. Has anything actually explicitly ended, or has it simply gone quiet? Silence and ending are not the same evidence. Are you still able to picture yourself hoping for the outcome, even if that hope feels tired, or has hope been replaced completely by numbness? Tiredness and numbness are different states. Tired hope is still hope. And has anything around you shifted at all, even in small, unrelated ways? The kind of quiet movement we talked about in an earlier season, being described as doors opening in rooms you didn't expect. None of these questions gives you certainty, but together they tend to separate an exhausted wait from an actual ending more honestly than simply asking how long it's been. There's a version of this waiting that plays out very ordinarily, away from anything dramatic. Think about someone checking their phone one more time before bed, hoping for a message that hasn't come in days. Think about someone driving past a building they applied to work at, wondering if the silence means they were passed over, or if the decision simply hasn't been made yet. Think about someone lying awake, running through a relationship that ended without a clear explanation, replaying it for the 100th time, searching for a sign of whether there's still a door open somewhere in it, or whether it's finally closed. None of these moments look like the dramatic biblical stories we just walked through, but they're built on the exact same structure, a silence that hasn't yet revealed which of the two answers it actually is. This is also where other people around you matter more than it might seem. Waiting in complete isolation makes it much easier to quietly convert a wait into a no, simply because there's no one else reflecting reality back to you. If you have even one person in your life who can hear you say, "I don't know if this is still coming," without immediately either dismissing your hope or feeding false certainty, that person is doing something valuable. They're helping you stay in the honest middle ground between denial and despair, which is exactly where quiet waiting is supposed to live. If you don't have someone like that right now, that's worth naming to yourself too, not as a failure, but as something worth seeking out, because waiting alone for long enough tends to distort the wait into whichever answer feels safer to assume. Let's talk about what waiting well actually looks like, because it's easy to describe in the abstract and much harder to live day to day. It doesn't mean pretending you feel nothing. It doesn't mean forcing a smile through genuine disappointment, or acting like the silence doesn't cost you anything. Lamentations 3:25-26 says, "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Notice the word quietly, not numbly, not in denial, not pretending, quietly, in the sense of not thrashing against a season you can't control, not making noise just to feel like you're doing something. Quiet waiting looks like continuing to build your life instead of pausing it. It looks like still showing up to what's in front of you today, even while part of you is fixed on what hasn't arrived yet. It looks like allowing yourself to feel the weight of the delay honestly, without letting that honesty tip over into deciding the promise is dead. Those are two different things, feeling the weight and declaring it over, and confusing them is exactly the trap this entire message is trying to help you avoid. There's also a kind of waiting that isn't quiet at all, and it's worth naming so you can recognize it if it's where you are right now. Anxious striving. This is the waiting that tries to force the appointed time to arrive early. Sarah's decision to intervene rather than continue waiting is the clearest biblical picture of it. It usually doesn't come from a lack of faith exactly. It comes from exhaustion, from a very human need to feel like you're doing something instead of simply enduring something. But forcing an early version of a promise rarely produces the same outcome as the one that would have arrived on its own timeline. It usually produces a complicated substitute instead, one that still has to be dealt with even after the real promise eventually shows up. If you recognize that kind of striving in your own life right now, trying to manufacture an outcome instead of continuing to wait for it, that's not a reason for shame. It's simply information. It tells you that the wait has gone on long enough to exhaust your patience, which is an honest human place to be. The response isn't to punish yourself for it. It's to notice it, name it, and return to quiet waiting instead of anxious forcing, as many times as it takes. It's worth being specific about what returning to quiet waiting actually looks like after a season of striving, because the instruction can sound simple while being genuinely hard to live out. It doesn't mean flipping a switch and suddenly feeling peaceful about something that's been costing you sleep. It means catching yourself the next time you reach for control, the extra message you're tempted to send, the situation you're tempted to force, the decision you're tempted to make just to end the discomfort of not knowing, and choosing, in that specific moment, to step back instead. That's not one decision made once. It's a decision made repeatedly, sometimes several times in a single day, and each time you make it, you're practicing the exact posture Lamentations describes, even if it doesn't feel peaceful yet. There's one more thing worth saying about this season, something that doesn't get said enough. You're allowed to ask God directly how long. Habakkuk, the same book that gave us the appointed time promise at the start of this message, actually opens with the prophet demanding to know why God hasn't acted yet, how long the waiting is supposed to last. That question isn't punished or dismissed in the text, it's answered with the promise that the vision has its own appointed time and that it will not delay. Asking honestly is not the same as giving up. Some of the most faithful voices in Scripture asked exactly the question you might be asking right now, and the response they received wasn't correction for asking. It was reassurance that the timeline was still intact. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A lot of people believe that expressing doubt or frustration about a delay is itself a failure of faith, something to hide or feel guilty about. But the pattern across these passages tells a different story. Sarah questioned. Habakkuk demanded an answer. Neither of them was met with rejection for asking honestly. What both of them eventually received was clarity about the timeline, not punishment for wanting one. If you've been carrying guilt about how frustrated or doubtful you felt during your own wait, that guilt isn't required. Asking how long, even asking it with real frustration behind it, is part of what honest waiting has always looked like. It's not evidence that you're doing it wrong. Here's what ties all of this together. Wait and no are not points on the same scale, where a long enough wait eventually becomes a no. They are two entirely different answers from the start. A no ends something. A wait postpones something to an appointed time that hasn't arrived yet. And nothing about the length of that postponement changes which of the two you're actually living inside. It's worth acknowledging, too, that some waits genuinely do end in no. Not every closed door reopens, and this message isn't asking you to pretend otherwise or to treat every disappointment as secretly a delayed yes. What it's asking is something narrower and more honest. Don't decide which one you're in based on time alone. A real no usually comes with something more concrete attached to it eventually. A clear circumstance, a closed reality, something beyond simple silence. If all you actually have right now is silence and the passage of time, that's not enough evidence on its own to conclude the answer is no. It's enough evidence to conclude you're still inside something you don't have the full picture of yet, which is a very different place to stand. So if you're in a season right now where nothing seems to be moving, no answer, no change, no visible sign that anything is happening, consider the possibility that you're not looking at a no dressed up as silence. You might simply be standing inside an appointed time that hasn't arrived yet, the same way Sarah once did, the same way Joseph once did in a cell that looked nothing like a palace, the same way every person who has ever waited on a real promise has stood exactly where you're standing now, without being able to see what was already being prepared just beyond their view. Ask yourself honestly, have you already decided, somewhere quietly inside yourself, that your wait has become a no? If you have, this might be the moment to reconsider that conclusion, not because waiting is easy, and not because there's a guarantee attached to how you feel about it, but because the same God who told Sarah an appointed time was still coming is not operating on a different pattern now than he was then. And if you haven't decided that yet, if some part of you is still holding on, even tiredly, even without proof, that part of you is not being foolish. It's doing exactly what quiet waiting has always looked like, staying present in an unfinished story without forcing an ending onto a chapter that hasn't closed. If this spoke to where you are right now, stay. There's more waiting for you here. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, because your appointed time hasn't been cancelled, it's simply still on its way.